Today we're going to make these elegant Art Deco inspired wire weave chandelier earrings. They have the classic dropped fan shape that you'll find frequently in jewelry from the Art Deco period. My name is Wendy and I'm the wire weaver behind door 44. If you want to learn to make wire jewelry, this channel's for you. We're going to use 3 different wire gauges and some 3mm beads for today's project. As always, you'll find a complete list of tools and materials in the video description below, and I'll call out the tools and materials that you'll need as I use them. Let's get started. Okay, to start out with, you're going to need about 7 inches of 20 gauge wire per earring, so 14 inches total, and I'm using dead soft wire today. This is from riogrande.com. You can use either half hard or dead soft wire for these earrings. Either temper will work fine. And we're going to start out with 2 pieces of 20 gauge wire that are 3.5 inches long. So I'm going to go ahead and measure those out. And of course you will need your wire cutters. And I like to always measure and mark my wires. Not absolutely necessary, but it is always a good idea to keep a ruler and a fine point permanent marker on hand. So I'm just going to cut 1 piece of wire, and then I will use that wire to measure the second piece. And the first part of this tutorial, we're going to make this woven portion here, the stick part that holds the fan. Okay, once you have your wires cut, we want to go ahead and mark those at the center of the wires. So these are 3.5 inches long. So we are going to mark them at 1 3/4 inches, which is right in the center of those wires. We're going to take our stepped bill making pliers and we're going to use the 2mm step here. And we're just going to fold these wires right in half. So I'm just going to grip right on that mark, and I'm just going to bend those wires down and fold it in half. And I'm going to go ahead and squeeze a little bit. I want to get a little bit past the halfway point. And you can see that that is almost dead center. I have just a little bit of an offset there, so we'll go ahead and trim that before we do our next step. I'm going to fold my second wire. And when you're making earrings, it's always a good idea to make them both at the same time. It just helps with maintaining symmetry on your earrings. And you can see on this one, same thing. We had just a little bit of a difference, and we want to get rid of that chisel tip anyway. So we're going to go ahead now and grab our wire cutters again. And if you have super flush cutters, that's ideal because you get a nice flat cut. You see how square that end is there? That's the result of having a nice pair of flush cutters. If you don't have that, you can always just file the tips of your wires. Not a big deal. You just want to remove any sharp points that you might have there. So I trimmed that first wire, and I'm going to go ahead and use this as a guide to trim my second wire, and it looks like I just need to take off just that chisel tip, and those are going to be the same length. So I'm going to carefully place my flush cutters right below that chisel tip and trim. So our wires are prepped, and now we're going to go ahead and use our chasing hammer and bench block. And I'm just using my 3.5 ounce chasing hammer, and this has a domed face, and my trusty bench block, which I love. Okay, now let's look at the structure of these and talk about positioning your wire for hammering. So we are going to form these pretty curls here at the ends, and if you notice, the smaller curl is flattened on a different plane than the larger curl. So we want to be careful when we're laying our wire on our bench block. We want to make sure that we are flattening on the correct plane, and it'll just make it easier to make your curls. You won't have to twist your wire into shape. It'll just all sort of flow together. Now the nice thing about this, where we cross these wires like that, so that gives us an opportunity to go ahead and flatten on the correct plane. So we're going to sort of emphasize that cross there, and notice that my bend is laying perpendicular to my bench block. It's not laying flat. If you lay it like that, you're going to flatten your wire on the wrong plane. So we want that positioned vertically, perpendicular. And I'm going to spread those wires out just a little bit, and then just hold that firmly with your fingers. And go ahead and just lightly paddle the ends of the wires just about 1/8 of an inch. You don't want to paddle very much. But we're just going to draw those out, some nice little paddles just like that. Okay, we're going to repeat that on this other ear wire. Again, just about 1/8 of an inch, not very much. And we don't want to paddle them We don't want to, make them too thick. We're just going to make those pretty little curls on the end. Okay. Next, we're going to use our needle file to just soften the corners on those paddles. If they came out nice and round, then you don't need to mess with them. But if they came out a little bit square tipped like mine did, then you want to just go ahead and gently round the edges. Doesn't take much, just a few really light strokes. And you see we have a much rounder profile on those. We're going to go ahead and do the same thing on our second wire. And like I say, this just takes a few light little strokes with your file. You don't need to use a lot of force. You're just lightly rounding those edges. All right, next step, we're going to take our stepped bill making pliers again, and we're going to begin with the 2mm step, the smallest one. And again, you want to pay attention to which direction you're going. So to begin these curls, we're going to curl toward the inside of this loop here. It's going to be a little bit awkward, but just go ahead and grasp the one paddle tip of your wire and make sure that your 2mm step is on the inside of the wire. See how I have that positioned? And we're just going to roll that around about 3/4 of the way around the tip of your pliers. Can you see how far I curled that? I might go just a little bit further. Take that a little bit further. There we go. We don't want it completely closed, but almost. And then we're going to do the same thing on this wire. Again, grasp at the very tip of the wire and hang on firmly, and then gently roll this toward the inside. And what we want to do is make sure that our wires end up the exact same length. If you have any differences here in length, then your finished curls are going to be different lengths as well. So you would just kind of want to look at that and make sure. See, this one's just a little bit more open than this one. So I'm going to go ahead and get back in there with my 2mm step. I'm going to continue to curl that just a little bit tighter. That's better. See how those ends line up now? And then we're going to flip our pliers around, and we're going to grasp with the 3mm step on the outside. And then we're just going to roll this around that 3mm step all the way until the smaller loop touches the shaft of your wire. And we're going to do that. Repeat that again on this side. Again, just roll it firmly against the 3mm step all the way until that curl meets the shaft. And these should end up almost exactly the same length. Now notice mine are just a little bit different. That's okay. We might be able to do a little bit of adjustment there before we start weaving, but this is what your piece should look like so far. And then we're just going to repeat that process on our second wire. So again, we're going to roll to the inside on the 2mm step, just like that. And we'll repeat that on this side. Again, make sure you're grabbing right at the tip, as close to the tip as you can, so that you get a nice line all the way through your curve. If you grab just below the tip, then you're going to get sort of a straight line on the end of your curl, and it's not going to look quite as good. And again, just keep rolling until you get those really close to the same length, as close as you can. Again, we're making handmade art. It's not going to be perfect, but you do want to aim for as much symmetry as you possibly can get. And then we're going to go ahead and use that 3mm step again to make our second part of the curl. So grasp with the 2mm step on the inside of your V and 3mm on the outside, and then you're just going to roll around that 3mm mandrel until you end up with a shape that looks just like that. And that one turned out really good. That one's almost exactly lined up. This one is not quite. So I think what we're going to do is we're just going to grab again this one, the longer one. And I think what happened here, notice how this curl is a little bit more open and there's a little bit of a straight line there. That's because, again, I didn't grasp right at the tip of that wire. I was kind of above the tip, so that didn't get formed completely to match the round shape of the mandrel, and just that little difference alone gave me a little bit more length on this one. So think about that. Make sure that when you're making curls and bends, make sure that you're doing them as tight as you possibly can. You want to stick as close to the mandrel as you can, and you want to grab as closely to the tip of the wire as you possibly can. But that's going to work pretty well. We'll go ahead and go with that. It be just a little bit off symmetry, but not so much that it's going to look terrible. Okay, so now that we've got these pieces sort of bent into position, I'm just going to use my fingers to kind of press that top part of the loop in a little bit so that my wires line up right next to each other, just like that. And we'll do the same thing on this wire. So again, we're just going to press those. I'm using my fingernails on my thumb and my index finger to kind of pinch just a little bit of a bend, not a super big bend. I don't want, a really obvious bend in those wires, but we're just going to pinch them a little bit so that these wires line up. The portion where we're going to weave, the wires are right next to each other. Okay. Next step, bring back your chasing block or your bench block and your chasing hammer, and we're just going to lightly hammer the top of this loop. And we're just doing that to harden the wire and to kind of lock in that shape there so that it holds its shape. And then we're going to very carefully hammer these bottom loops as well. Be careful. Notice how I'm covering my small loops. I want to make sure that I don't damage those with my hammer, because we want that dimension. See how that these have, they're flattened this way, and then these are flattened on this plane, and these are still nice and clean. We didn't nick them with our hammer, so they're not smashed, they're not bent. That's what we want. And all this does, we're just work hardening the wire so that it'll hold its shape a little bit better. And anytime you make bends in wire, curves like this, if you can hammer, it'll just help lock in those bends and help your finished jewelry maintain its shape. So again, I'm just using a few light strokes. I'm not hammering a lot. Notice I'm not really drawing out a lot. I'm using just a very short drawing stroke. And that's because I want to thicken out that line a little bit, but I don't want to draw it out too much. We're using just 20 gauge wire here. 20 gauge wire is pretty thin, so you don't want to draw it out too much or it'll get too thin and it could get really fragile, and then you run the risk of your wire breaking. Okay, once we're finished with that, I'm just going to use my stepped bill making pliers again to kind of bend those loops back into position. If they spread out a little bit when you were hammering, we just want to press them back up close to the shaft there. And that happens whenever you're hammering wire. It's going to stretch the wire, and it will often open up any curves that you have. So we just want to press those closed again. And you can see here the difference in length there is a little bit exaggerated now since we've hammered. That's okay. It's going to be fine. We're just going to have to be careful when we add the fan shape onto this frame that we get the fan straight. No worries there. You can always make adjustments as you go along. Don't worry about trying to get things perfect. You won't. You can aim for perfection, and that's a good thing, but the truth of the matter is you're just not going to achieve perfection with wire because it's not that agreeable of a material. Wire tends to have a little bit of a mind of its own, and you just sort of have to learn to work with its quirks. All right, we're going to start out with about 18 inches of 28 gauge dead soft wire. You'll need about that length for each ear wire, and we're going to go ahead and weave these two wires together. So I'm going to start with my wire. I always place my wire, this is just personal habit, I always start with my wire behind my core wire, whatever I'm weaving, and I always start on the bottom. So I'm just going to coil this wire about 3 times around that bottom wire, and then I'm just going to do modified sumac weave here, and I'm going to weave all the way down to those curls. If you're not familiar with this weave, I have a tutorial that will show you how to do this weave both left-handed and right-handed. So I will link to that tutorial right up here in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. And if you click on that, it'll mark that video for you so you can go back and watch it later. This is a really simple weave. It's really my favorite weave. It's the one that I use most frequently, and it's because it's a really stable weave. It's a clean weave, and the thing I love most about it is it looks almost identical on the back as it does on the front. You don't have a wildly different texture on the back than you do on the front. And that's one of the things I like about wire weaving. A lot of wire wrapping techniques, you get a really neat look on the front, but then you look at the back and it's sort of a funky look. So I tend to stick with weaving patterns that look very similar on the front and the back of my jewelry, because I always like the back to look good too. So we're just going to keep on weaving here And if you have trouble hanging on to your piece while you're doing that, you know, if you get some hand pain, if you have carpal tunnel or something like that, you want to minimize gripping with your fingers really tightly. So you can just grab on with your nylon jaw pliers or with your ring clamp. That works really well to hold jewelry while you're weaving. And I'm just going to go ahead and keep on weaving until I get up to the point where those curls meet the shaft of the wire, and then I'm going to integrate those into my weave. So I've got a few more passes to make here. I'm getting really close to where I want to add that. I'm going to do one more pattern repeat here, and then I'm going to start tying that bottom loop into my weave. So right here, I'm going to continue this pattern, and now I'm going to have to thread my wire through the loop. And I always just do one pattern repeat whenever I'm binding one of those curls down with this weave. I'll just do one repeat. So I'm just going to have 2 wraps around that piece, and that's going to hold that curl nice and securely so it's not going to get pulled out of position. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull this one in as well. So we've got 1 pass around that wire and then 2 passes, and then I'm just going to go back to weaving these 2 wires together. And whenever you're weaving through closed spaces like these loops, you want to just be very careful when you're pulling your wire through that you don't create any kinks. Now on a piece like this with these small loops, and we're using a short piece of wire, you don't have to worry about that too much. But if you have longer, a longer length of weaving wire, then you want to be really careful here about creating kinks. So I like to use my finger to create a loop so that pulls smoothly through the wire whenever I'm weaving in a closed space like this. And that'll just keep your wire from sort of kinking. And again, you can see I'm creating that loop, and that just guides that wire through the loop smoothly without any kinks. Now at this point, I'm going to finish off my weave with 3 wraps around this side. And notice I did this a little bit strategically. So at the beginning, I secured my wire to this wire on the bottom. And as I'm finishing off, I'm going to secure it to this wire. And we're going to use that in our finished earrings. Okay, I'm just breaking my wire off there. So again, if you're not familiar with my wire breaking technique, just get in there, press that wire tightly up against the core wire with your thumbnail, and you're going to tug firmly and swirl and break. This is the cleanest way to finish off weaving wire. I almost never trim my weaving wire with wire cutters. I always break it, and that's because it comes out much more cleanly. You don't end up with any sharp bits sticking out. Okay, so we finished our first earring component, and now we're going to go ahead and weave the second one. And again, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm leaving a little more than an inch tail there, and I'm going to secure this wire with 3 wraps around the bottom core wire. And then I'm just going to start weaving, and I'm going to weave just below the point where that wire curves a little bit to form our loop. So I'm going to do the modified sumac weave. And if you are unfamiliar with this weave, once again, I'll link it in the video description. There'll be a section there headed related videos, and you'll find links to any videos that I reference in this tutorial. They'll be there in the video description if you don't catch the links that I share in this video. So we're just going to go ahead and weave these together. And this goes really quickly. I like doing earrings like this that have just a little bit of weaving because it adds a beautiful texture, but it doesn't create so much work. Weaving can be really time consuming, but sometimes just a little splash of weave in a piece adds that beautiful texture and doesn't, make the jewelry so time consuming to make that you can't, produce multiples cost effectively. And as always, if you want to sell jewelry from my tutorials, you're welcome to do that. I appreciate it if you credit me, but I understand that, when you're trying to grow a jewelry business, sometimes there's so much more to do that you just don't have a lot of time to sit down and design jewelry. So I am all about supporting makers, and if you want to use my designs and sell them, any design that's in a tutorial, you're welcome to do that. And again, we're just going to capture this wire, that curl, and we're going to lock that in there, bind it to our stick with just one pattern repeat. And then again, notice I'm catching that wire and forming that loop and pulling it through. So I get a nice smooth transition whenever I'm passing through those closed loop spaces. And when I'm coming through the back on this one, again, capturing that loop, and notice how cleanly that comes through there. You don't get any kinks. That's what we're after. One of the biggest frustrations I see with beginner wire weavers is, they get frustrated because their wire breaks while they're weaving. And that usually happens because you've allowed your wire to kink at some point. Anytime you get a kink in your wire, you weaken it and it'll break. So we want to always make sure that our wire passes smoothly and cleanly through closed spaces without any kinks. And we're just going to continue weaving here. Let's see, on this one, let's make sure we get these symmetrical. So on this one, I added, let's see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Looks like 4 pattern repeats after the binding. So let's see, we've got 2 pattern repeats there. We're going to do 2 more. So I'm just going to continue weaving. So this is 3. And the way that I count pattern repeats on this weave is I count the wire that goes over both wires. So the long pass over the front. And you notice there's 3 of those right now. And we're going to do the single wrap pass on the way up. And then our double pass when we cross both wires is on the downward pass. So this is 4. And then I'm going to finish off by making 1 single wrap around that bottom wire. And then I'm going to bind off my wire with 3 wraps around this top one. So there's 1, 2, and 3. So once again, notice that we started on the bottom wire. We bound our wire, weaving wire to the bottom wire, and we bound it off on the top wire. And that is because we want to create symmetry on these earrings, so we're going to mirror these components, and we're going to end up with perfectly mirrored pair of earrings, right down to the binding detail on those components. All right, so here are 2 pieces, and you can see that this is where I bound the wire. I'm going to flip that over. So this is going to be the front face of one earring, and this is going to be the front face of the other earring. And they are now perfectly mirrored, where we have even our bindings mirrored. See how that works? Okay, so we're at the point where we want to talk about the kinds of beads that you can use on this earring design, because we're at the point where we want to select our beads. So for these earrings, which are the original prototype that I made, I used 3x4mm crystal rondels, and these beads work out perfectly. You can see that I used balled end head pins. If you are not familiar with how to ball the ends of wire, be sure to check out this video. I'll link to that right up there in the upper right hand corner, and I walk you through the process of balling wire with a torch. Really simple to do. I used 22 gauge wire for these little dangles here, and then I used 26 gauge wire for this lace portion and for attaching this bead here. This is the next step we're going to do. We're going to attach our bead here. Now, like I say, you can use any bead that's about 3mm. These are pretty little peridot gemstone beads, and they're sort of a cube-shaped bead, and they're faceted. They're really pretty. I will link to the source for these beads in the description below if you'd like to get some gemstone beads that are similar to this. I have a great source that I love that has some really pretty micro-faceted small gemstone beads. And again, I used 26 gauge wire for this lacing technique, which we're going to get to soon, and then for adding this bead here to our stick component. Now for today, I thought I'd try something very different, and I'm going to use these 3mm drop beads. I love these beads. They're so pretty, and they're such a pretty color for spring. This gorgeous orange, fiery orange beads. So we're going to use a little bit of a different technique for attaching the beads. I'm not going to make head pins, obviously. You know, you could do the ball end head pins here. You could do just a simple head pin with a curled end, and if you want to know how to do that, you can check out my Lucky You earrings series, where I walk you through the process of making some tiny little teardrop shaped head pins for beads. And again, I'll link to that right up here in the upper right hand corner. But today we're going to go ahead and try this design out with these little drop beads, and we'll see how it turns out. Let's see what happens. So let's talk about these beads for just another moment. I want to point out something about buying beads that's really important. First of all, I used 10 beads per earring on these. So there are 9 beads on the fringe, and then of course the accent bead here. I don't know that we're going to fit that many beads on these earrings here, because these beads are actually, so they're about 3 by 5 millimeters. And you notice they get really heavy there at the bottom. So we probably won't be able to put 9 beads on the fringe. We're going to work that out as we do the fringe. But the other thing I want to point out, this is a bead buying tip. So these beads have this beautiful fiery orange color, right? Aren't they just gorgeous? But I want you to notice something. See how this string is the same color as the beads? That is a really good indication that these beads are coated. Their color is not true. It's not all the way through the glass. It's just a coating that's put on the glass after the beads are made. So these are probably clear glass teardrops, and then they were dipped in an orange poly coating that gave them this beautiful color. So the thing about coated beads, they're not super high quality beads, and they're not going to maintain their color forever. This color will wear off, especially if the beads are handled quite a bit. If they're touched frequently, it'll start to eventually flake off. If this is exposed to UV light, so you wear these earrings in the sun a lot, that will eventually dry this coating and it'll start to crack, and eventually it'll wear off. Another thing about this coating is it will not survive a jewelry tumbler. So these earrings are going to have to be patinaed and polished by hand, and I will definitely not tumble these beads because it would destroy this beautiful orange color here. So just a little buying tip: whenever you see beads strung on string that have the same color as the beads, and you can see where, you know, this is literally like paint that's on that string. This started out as white string. You can see there, wherever a bead was laying, the paint didn't get all the way through the hole. So you get those little white bits, and then you get the paint on the string between the beads. Just keep that in mind. It's not always easy to spot coated beads. Another way that you can kind of get to know whether or not a bead is true colors or if it's coated is they have sort of a plasticky feel to them. If you rub it with your fingernail, it feels like an acrylic bead. If you've ever felt the difference between an acrylic bead and a glass bead, this has a very similar feel to an acrylic bead. So just keep that in mind. I pulled out 20 beads here. I don't think we're going to use that many, again, because our fringe is just going to be the beads, in order to get them to hang nicely, we're going to have to space our loops out a bit to give those beads a little bit more space to breathe. So instead of doing 2 wraps on each of these loops, we'll probably do maybe 3 or 4. We'll add a little bit of extra space, and we might end up with, something more along the lines of 5 or 7 beads in our fringe. We'll see how it works out. But to get started right now, I'm going to start with some 26 gauge dead soft wire, and I'm going to use just about probably 4 or 5 inches. I'm not even going to measure this. I'm just going to estimate it. About 4 or 5 inches of wire per frame. So I'm going to go ahead and cut that length. You don't need a lot of wire for this. We're just going to bind one of our drops onto our loops there at the bottom, that accent bead. And to do this, I'm going to go ahead and start on one end of my loop. I usually start on the left side for some reason. There's no particular reason. It's just the way that I always tend to do it. And I'm going to wrap that wire twice around that loop. And you can use your pliers here if you have trouble hanging on to that. I usually do it with my fingers. And then I'm just going to do a nice tight binding there. Wrap that about 2 times around that wire that's coming through. just like that. Make sure that your binding wraps, that tail comes out on the back of your long wire. See how I did that? And then we're just going to thread one bead on, and we will bring that long wire over. And now we're going to do the same thing. We're going to wrap, start from the back, and I'm going to come up through this loop. So there's once, and I want to make sure I get that on there so that my bead is hanging pretty straight. See that there? And then I'm going to do a second wrap, and then I'm going to come up through this gap here where the bead is hanging, and we're going to wrap that wire twice around the wire where our bead is hanging. And you want to do 2 nice snug wraps, and again we want to finish that off in the back. So now we can come back here and we're going to break these wires off, and this can be a little bit tricky, but I'm just going to, again, I'm pressing really firmly with my thumbnail, and I'm pressing that wire up against the wire that it's wrapped around. And I'm going to tug, swirl, and break. Now 26 wire doesn't always break super cleanly, so you may need to get in there with your chain nose pliers and tuck in that broken end, and we'll do that in just a moment. I'm going to go ahead and break this wire first. So again, I'm pressing firmly on that wire with my thumbnail, and I'm going to tug, swirl, and break. And let's see what we got here. That broke pretty cleanly. And this one here is sticking up just a little bit, so I'm going to get in there with my chain nose pliers, and I'm going to just very gently tuck that broken end in there. Okay, so there is the front of our frame with our accent bead. These are going to be really pretty. Okay, now you got to pay attention here at this point because we talked about symmetry on these earrings. So this earring has the wrap loops on the inside here, or I guess I should say on the right side. May or may not be the inside depending on whether or not this is the left or right earring. But we're going to start with these wrap loops on the right side. So for this one, we want the front of our earring to have those loops on the left side. So again, we're going to be super careful when we're adding this accent bead that we get this component oriented properly. So again, I'm going to start out the same way. I'm threading my wire up through the back of the loop, and I'm going to loop that through. And I did a pretty short loop there, so I'm going to just grab that with my chain nose pliers and make sure that's nice and snug. And then we're going to carefully wrap that around twice. And you want to slide those wraps up so that they're nice and snugly, snugged up tight against the loop there. And again, we're going to thread on a bead. This gets a little bit fiddly sometimes when you don't have a lot of space to work with, but we're going to thread that up through the back again and bring it around. Make sure that your bead has space to hang freely. You don't want to pull that too tight so that your bead is hanging at an awkward angle. And we're going to wrap twice around that loop like that. And then I'm going to come around the back up through the space where our bead is hanging. And make sure your tail and your other piece doesn't get in the way here. And just pull that wire up nice and snugly and wrap it twice around that wire before breaking it off. Make sure you get through the right space. You want to come through the space where the bead is hanging. And I think I might actually break this one off in the front so that I get complete wraps there. Okay, so I have one wire coming out the front face and one wire coming out the back, and our binding wires are on the left side. So we're going to have a mirrored pair of earrings here. See that? And I'm going to go ahead and break this on the front side, but I'm going to try to get it so that it doesn't hang out too far in the front. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I want some nice, complete, secure wraps back here. Notice on this one, I ended up with basically just one wrap there in the back. I don't want that. That could potentially come loose at some point. It's just not quite secure enough. So that's why I'm breaking this wire on the front instead of the back. And again, I'm just going to use my thumbnail to put pressure on that bead, and I'm going to tug, swirl, and break. And luckily that broke pretty cleanly. You can see just a little hint of the tail there coming out the front. That's okay. And then for these earrings, or for this tail, I'm going to break this one in the back. So I'm going to bring it all the way to the back, press firmly with my thumbnail, tug, swirl, and break. And again, I'm going to just tuck that end in gently. All right. So there are our earring components, and you can see they're perfectly mirrored. We've got the binding wire on the right here and on the left here, and down here on the left and on the right. So it doesn't matter which of these earrings, you know, it doesn't really matter which one's the left or the right, but we just want them to be perfectly mirrored, and they are. Okay, let's move on to making our fan shape. So to make our fans, we're going to use 20 gauge wire again. And again, I'm using the same dead soft wire I used for the first component. You can use half hard if that's what you have on hand. It'll work just fine. It'll be a little bit trickier to get your piece attached to your first component, but that's okay. And we're going to use about 4 inches of wire. And this doesn't have to be super precise because we're going to end up trimming some of this wire off, but you want to give yourself at least 4 inches to make your fan. And I'm going to go ahead and cut one piece off, and then I'm going to use that piece to measure my second piece and cut that. Okay, now we want to mark these wires at the spots where we're going to make our bends. So first we're going to want to find the center of this wire, and then we're going to mark the point where we're going to make this bend, these 2 bends, and then we're going to mark the point again where we're going to attach here. And I'm going to use about a 1/2 inch for each of those marks. So I'm going to start with my center mark, and I'm going to go ahead and mark both of these wires at the same time. So I'm just going to line them up and place them on my ruler. Now if you use the metric system, I will point out these measurements in centimeters on screen. I think in the imperial system, so it's a little bit difficult for me to translate those on the fly, but I will definitely throw those measurements up on the screen so you know what they are in the metric system. Okay, so I'm marking these wires at 2 inches, which is right dead center, and then I'm going to put a mark at a 1/2 inch increments, 2 marks at a 1/2 inch increments on either side of that center mark. So I have one at 2.5 inches, one at 3, and then one at 1.5 inches, and one at 1 inch. So we're just forming these increments that we're going to use to form our fan shape. And if you look at this fan here, it's about 1 inch wide. So I took the center mark and then a 1/2 inch out on either side to give me that 1 inch wide length. And then I formed my bends and attached those to the first component. So let's go ahead and give these wires a little bit of a bend. And to do that, you just need a round object that's about, I don't know, 1 3/4 round. You can see kind of, you know, about how big that is. You can use any round object that you have in your house. You can use a jar. A pill bottle works well for this. This is a plumbing fitting. It's a 1 3/4 inch plumbing union, copper union. And I'm just going to bend these wires around this union just to give them a slightly curved shape. This isn't strictly necessary, but it does give your earrings a cleaner look. You can do this easily by hand if you like, but I like using a mandrel because I just think it gives me a more finished look. All right, now that we have that bend in there, we're going to take our flat nose pliers and we're going to grip at each of these marks that we made. So I'm gripping just to the left of that mark. I'm left-handed, so I'm always going to grab on the left side of a mark when I do my bends. If you're right-handed, you're going to grab on the right side to do your bends. So I'm going to grab right here on the left of that mark and I'm going to bend that in just like that. So I'm making sort of looks a little bit like an eye. And then we're going to do the same thing on this side. Make sure you're grabbing on the right mark. So there's my center mark, and this is the first mark to the side of that center, and we're going to bend that about the same length. So we have a shape that looks just like that. And then you can go ahead and place your pliers on the other marks that you made, and we're going to bend this up just like that. And we want to do the same thing on the other side. Bend that straight up. So you end up with a piece that looks something like this. We'll do the same thing on our other wire. So we start with, there's our center mark, and we're starting with the first mark to the left of center. And then the first mark to the right of center. Just like that. Try and get your angles even. so that the shape is nice and symmetrical. And then you can again grab at the next mark, bend that up and bend that up. So we're going to get our chasing hammer and our bench block, and we're just going to lightly hammer this bottom curve. Again, I'm not hammering heavily. I'm using light taps. I want to flatten it just slightly, and I don't want to draw it out. I don't want to make it too thick, but I want to flatten all the way across the bottom and just a bit of those corners so that we lock in that corner shape. And that'll help this component hold its shape while we're attaching it to our first components, because this does get a little bit difficult when we're attaching this frame. Go ahead and hammer the second one. Again, make sure you catch those corners, and I'm not making them super flat, but I just want to stiffen them up a little bit so they really hold their shape. This wire we don't want to hammer. We want to keep this as soft as possible. If you're using half hard wire, you're going to have to work a little bit harder to get these attached neatly. Dead soft is a little bit more cooperative, and that's what I'm using here. All right, so next we're going to attach these to our frames. So at this point, again, you got to really pay attention to where the front of your frame is, and this is the front face of my frame. So I want that wire to come from the back up through that loop, and then we're going to make 2 wraps. So at this point, I'm going to take my flat nose pliers again, and I'm just going to bend this wire up 90 degrees. So it looks like that. We'll do the same thing on the other side. Put a 90-degree bend there. See how that works? And then we can feed those wires through your loops just like that. See how this is coming together? And now we're going to take that wire straight across and bend it to the side. On both sides, make sure you get it fairly snug. And you can, if you like, at this point, you can kind of use your flat nose pliers. We want to make sure these wires are coming sort of straight across, and then you can kind of gently give that wire a little bit of a squish so we can tighten that bend there. There, that one worked out really well. This one's being a little bit stubborn. So I'm just going to kind of pinch those wires together so that they're right on top of each other. And then I'm going to give that a good squish. So that sort of locks my frame into place. And now we just need to complete 2 wraps. So you may need to use your chain nose pliers to do this, because it gets a little tricky to do it with your fingers. And wire can be a little tough to hang on to. So we're just going to feed that wire through one more time and pull it all the way through, and then you can use your pliers to gently squeeze. Be super gentle here. You don't want to create tool marks, but we just want to squeeze that wire tightly around the loop on our first component. And then we're just going to continue that bend toward the back. And at this point, you can trim off that tail. Carefully trim that in the back. And then tuck in your cut end so it's nice and tight on the back. And there we go. So that's what this is going to look like from the front. And you can see this wire's not super straight. We're gonna straighten that out once we get this other side attached. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to wrap twice around that curl on our first component. And just feed that wire through with your needle nose pliers or your chain nose pliers. And you can pull that snugly. And we're just going to make sure that's wrapped nice and tightly around. If your wraps kind of spread out, you can just kind of squeeze them together. We want them nice and neat. And I'm going to go ahead and trim off on the back. And I'm going to tuck that wire tightly up against that curl. So we want these wraps to be really neat, snug, stacked up next to each other, and sort of parallel with the bottom of the frame. And now you can see our frame is a little wonky. That happens, and you can just kind of play with it a little bit until you get that shape. Let's see if I can get it in there with my flat nose pliers, and we'll squeeze that just a little bit. Get any funky bends out of there so that our fan is hanging nice and neatly and symmetrically. See that? Just keep playing with it until you get it looking the way that you want it to look. And again, you might have to, if you come out in the back of your frame and kind of, you can also use your nylon dowel pliers to kind of squish those wires down neatly. That often helps a lot, and you don't run the risk of marking your wire up. And there we go. That looks pretty good. So we're just going to repeat that on the second frame, and then we'll be back to start adding our fringe. So here are my earrings, and we're nearly finished. We're now ready to go ahead and start putting on our fringe. And to do the fringe, again, I'm going to just use 26 gauge dead soft wire, and I'm going to use, I don't know, I'm just going to measure out, say about 7 inches maybe. You don't need a ton of wire for this, but you want to make sure that you have enough to make your fringe. You don't want to run out of wire midway through. So give yourself plenty of length. And I'm going to cut 2 pieces the same length. Okay. So now let's go ahead and start adding our fringe. And we're going to do this a little bit differently than I did the fringe for these earrings. So you can see here that I created these loops here, and then I added the beaded dangles onto each loop. We're actually going to do this a little bit differently because we're using teardrop beads, and they are top drilled. We're just going to make our loop, and we're going to thread our beads right onto that loop. So those beads will hang without having to add an extra head pin to make a beaded dangle. And once again, if you need to know how to use a torch to make balled ends on your wire, I will link to that video in the description below if you missed it earlier when I pointed out. That will be right down there in the description in the related videos section, so you can learn to make balled end head pins. Super easy to do and a lot of fun too. All right, so to get started, we're going to go ahead and take one of our pieces of wire, and we're going to start again on the back of the wire frame. And I'm going to, leave yourself a little tail that you can grab onto easily, about 1 inch long. And we're just going to wrap that nice and snugly 3 times around that frame. And then we want to snug those wraps up. I'm going to take that tail and put it in the back. At this point, you're going to want to use a pair of round nose pliers. And we're just going to use these pliers to form a loop. And I'm going to, you can see my marks are kind of faded there. I'm going to go ahead and add those marks back in. Just mark the jaws of your pliers at some point so that you know where to grab on, so that we make consistently sized loops. And I'm going to be making fairly large loops on these. If I wanted smaller loops, like on these earrings, I used slightly smaller loops because I have smaller beads. So I think I used closer to the tip of these pliers to make these loops. But we're gonna go ahead and make these loops kind of wide so that the bead can hang on that loop comfortably without being pinched and kind of skewed out of alignment. So we have our 3 wraps, and I'm just going to grasp my frame right at that mark, and I'm going to pull this wire around and up, just like that. So that gives me that nice curved shape. And then I'm going to feed a bead onto my wire. Let that bead drop. And there's our first fringe dangle. So now we're just going to wrap this wire around the frame. I'm going to go through front to back, bring it around, and we're going to wrap a few times. Now on the prototype earrings that I made 2 wraps between fringes. And we might still be able to get away with that on this too. We're just going to go ahead and wrap around at least one more time, get our loops pulled nice and neatly together. And I think 3 is going to work well. That's going to give us a pretty good gap right there. And again, this bead is hanging, dangling freely. See how we get some movement there? We want to make sure we have movement on these beads. If you make your loops too tight, your beads are going to get kind of stuck on the wire and they're not going to dangle. It's not going to be as pretty. So there's 3 wraps around the frame, and then again we're going to grab right there at our marks and pull that wire up and across the front of the frame. So that gives us a nice even loop. See how that's working out? And again, we'll slide another bead onto our wire, let that drop, and that's going to work out perfectly. See now how our beads are hanging freely. They've got lots of movement and they're not quite touching. There's a little bit of space between them. That's exactly what we want. When we're using these teardrop beads, we've got to give them a little more room to breathe than we do with something like a rondel or a round bead where we're attaching with a head pin. So again, we're going to wrap 3 times from front to back. So there's 1, 2, and just use your nails to slide those wraps up neatly together next to each other. And 3. And again, make sure that your beads are hanging freely. We don't have anything binding them up there, so they move nice and freely. Get your wraps nice and snug. Grab with your round nose pliers, again at the mark, and pull your loop up. And we're just going to keep on repeating this until we get probably 5. Maybe we can get 7 on here. I don't think so. I think we're going to end up with 5 because this is basically right in the center there. So we're going to have 5 fringe beads on these. And that's okay. You want to keep your fringe if you can. Keep it to an odd number of beads. And that's odd numbers are a little bit more pleasing to the eye. So that's the only reason I say an odd number. Sometimes it just works out that you end up with an even number, and that's okay. But shoot for an odd number of fringe beads. So 5, 7, 9, somewhere along those lines. I used 9 on the original prototype earrings and on the peridot earrings that I made. Peridot is my birthstone, so anytime I get an opportunity to make peridot jewelry, I take it, and I thought these earrings were a perfect opportunity for that. So there's our 3rd fringe bead, and now we're just going to add our 4th, make the loop, pull that wire nice and snug up around the round nose pliers, slide your bead onto the lacing wire and hold that nice and firmly. Feed that wire through, and there's 1 wrap, 2, and 3. Now the more loops that you're going to use, the longer you're going to want your lacing wire to be. So I use 7 inches for this. You may want to go ahead and use 8 inches or more if you're adding more loops and more beads. We're going to end up with just 5 beads here, and I think these are going to look really pretty. String on your bead and make your wraps. So just push that through. And there's 1, 2, and 3. And we're going to have just enough room for 1 more fringe bead, which is going to give us, we're going to end up with 6. And I think that'll be all right. Like I say, it's good to aim for an odd number whenever you're doing this sort of thing, fringe, something like that. But in this case, I'm going to end up with 6, and that's going to be just the right number to finish off this frame. So we'll just go with that. And again, we're going to wrap this 3 times around. So 1, 2, make sure you're right in the corner there. We want to finish right in that corner. And our beads are all still dangling freely. Nothing is sort of bound up. Everything hangs nice and freely. They move around a lot. And we can go ahead and get in there with my chain nose pliers, and I'm just gonna gently squeeze those 3 wraps together. Same thing on this side. Then I'm going to break this 26 gauge wire. Same thing, press tightly with my thumb. And 26 gauge is a little bit harder to break this way, so you can also trim this wire if you like. I like to break fine gauge wires whenever I can, but you may just need to do a little bit more neatening up and tucking in that end there when you break this wire. And this one we're going to break, we want to break it not quite at the edge of that frame wire there, so it doesn't wrap all the way around the edge, so you can't see the tail from the front, but you can tuck that in there neatly. And there is our first earring. Not pretty? These are going to be fun. Okay, so now I know I need 6 beads for my next frame. So in this case we ended up with 7 beads total per earring, so 14 total beads. And like I say, these are 3 by 5 millimeter teardrops, I think. Tiny little teardrop top drill beads. On these earrings I used 10 beads per earring, so 20 total, and these are 3 by 4 millimeter rondels, crystal rondels. And then on the peridot earrings I also used 10 beads per earring, and these are 3 millimeter faceted cubes. Our earrings are almost done, and I just want to point out one last tip for symmetry. So this is the first earring that I made, and I started wrapping over here on the right hand side with my wire behind the frame. So I added 3 wraps and the wire came out behind, and then I came over the top of the frame. On this earring I started the exact same way, only I started wrapping from the left side of the frame. So you can see that this wrapping on our wire looped lace is mirrored on these earrings, just like we finished off these points where we secured our weaving wire. So we maintain that mirror finish, and here our loop starts from the back and then it comes over the top, and we end up here coming over the top, and we're over the top here. See how that works out? So that's just another tip when you're making earrings. You want to keep things mirrored if that's important to you. It's not important to everybody. I like to do it. I think it looks nicer. I think it adds a finishing detail that people don't even necessarily see and recognize, yet the piece is pleasing to their eye somehow, and they don't know why exactly, but that's why. It's these neat little finishing details where you just mirror every aspect of the earring. And now we're ready to go ahead and put on some ear wires. So I'm just going to use my very simple French hook ear wires on these, and I have lots of different ear wire shapes that you can use. I have a tutorial bundle on my website that gives you 5 different ear wire shapes. These ear wires are ready to use. So to put them on, we're just going to twist them open like a jump ring. So give it a little twist, and then slide your earring on. Make sure you've got the front side forward. So we're just going to slide that on and twist that closed. Make sure everything's lined up neatly. Okay, there you go. These earrings are complete and ready for patina and polish. I will go ahead and patina these using my regular patina process. If you don't know what that process is, I will link to a video right up here in the right hand corner. If you love making wire earrings, be sure to check out this video. I'll share another wire lacing technique that allows you to create the look of channel set gemstones using beads instead of cabochons. That's it for today, wire weaver. Until next time, go make something beautiful.